Hello, friends. Welcome back to Chapter 3. Last time we were together, we got to see Stanley's first adventure where he took a ride through the United States Postal Service to visit a friend in California, which was pretty fun. And I left you with an idea, at least for what the next chapter was about. Chapter 3 is called Stanley the Kite. Mr. Lambchop had always liked to take the boys out with him on Sunday afternoons to a museum or roller skating in the park, but it was difficult when they were crossing streets or moving about in crowds. Stanley and Arthur would often be jostled from his side, and Mr. Lambchop worried about speeding taxis or that hurrying people might accidentally knock them down. The word jostled back here means to be kind of bumped around. So you're more likely to be jostled in a big crowd of people. If it's just you in your house, it's not really a word that we would often use. So it's common whether you are half an inch thick or normal sized that a parent is worried about their child being jostled out in public. It was easier after Stanley got flat. Mr. Lambchop discovered that he could roll Stanley up without hurting him at all. He would tie a piece of string around Stanley to keep him from unrolling and make a little loop in the string for himself. It was as simple as carrying a parcel, another word for a package, and he could hold on to Arthur with the other hand. Stanley did not mind being carried because he had never much liked to walk. Arthur didn't like to walk either, but he had to. It made him mad. Remember, we kind of learned that about him in the last chapter, that sometimes he felt a little bit jealous because Stanley could slide underneath of the door, even if it was closed or locked, and Arthur wanted to be able to do the same, and he just bumped his head, and now here he is again, not wanting to walk, being a little bit lazy, so it makes him feel a little bit mad. There we go. One Sunday afternoon in the street, they met Ralph Jones, an old college friend of Mr. Lambchop's. "Well, George, I see you have bought some wallpaper," Mr. Jones said. "Going to decorate your house, I suppose." "Wallpaper?" said Mr. Lambchop. "Oh, no, this is my son Stanley." He undid the string, and Stanley unrolled. "How do you do?" Stanley said. "Nice to meet you, young feller," the man said. "George," he said to Mr. Lambchop, "that boy is flat." It's kind of a little bit strange to think of, for sure. So over here, you can see what Stanley looks like, all rolled up, and how they explained how Mr. Lambchop is using a string to kind of hold on to him. And we can get a better picture of his brother over here, who is feeling a little bit mad that he has to actually do the walking. And now over here, we have the introduction, where he reaches out his hand to say, "Hi, my name's Stanley. How do you do?" Which is pretty funny. And then obviously the man says something very obvious. "That boy is flat." "Smart too," Mr. Lambchop said. "Stanley is third from the top in his class at school." "Phooey," said Arthur. "This is my younger son, Arthur," Mr. Lambchop said, "and he will apologize for his rudeness." Arthur could only blush and apologize. That means your cheeks get a little bit red because you're feeling embarrassed, because he had to apologize. Mr. Lambchop rolled Stanley up again, and they set out for home. It rained quite hard while they were on the way home. Stanley, of course, hardly got wet at all, just around the edges. But Arthur got soaked, and you can see that down here. See that he's looking a little bit more mad even than he was before. Late that night, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop heard a noise out in the living room. They found Arthur lying on the floor near the bookcase. He had piled a great many volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica on top of himself. So what he's doing, this is kind of an older book. Many times when we want information, we go straight to the computer. But there do exist books called encyclopedias that hold a lot of information about a lot of different topics. And they tend to be pretty thick as a result of all that information inside. So he finds Arthur with a great many volumes. So it was typically like anything that starts with the letter A is in one book, B is in another book, C is in another book. And he's stacking them up on top of himself. And then he says, "Put some more on me," Arthur said when he saw them. "Don't just stand there, help me." Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop sent him back to bed. But the next morning they spoke to Stanley. "Arthur can't help being jealous," they said. "Be nice to him. You're his big brother after all." So Arthur was trying to be flat, just like Stanley. And he's feeling very jealous. If you were following Miss Balin's activities last week, she talked about lots of feelings, and anger and jealousy are both two very strong feelings that his brother is feeling right now. Maybe you can empathize is a fancy word we could use if you've ever felt jealous or if you've ever felt angry at a younger brother or sister or an older brother or sister for being able to do something that you can't do. Sometimes it makes us feel a little jealous and angry. The next Sunday, Stanley and Arthur went to the park by themselves. The day was sunny, but windy too, and many older boys were flying beautiful, enormous kites with long tails made in all the colors of the rainbow. Arthur sighed. "Someday," he said, "I will have a big kite, and I will win a kite flying contest and be famous like everyone else. Nobody knows who I am these days." Stanley remembered what his parents had said. He went to a boy whose kite was broken and borrowed a large spool of string. That's what holds the string at the bottom, a spool. It has a bar in the middle, and then you kind of wrap the string around it. "You can fly me, Arthur," he said. "Come on." He attached the string to himself and gave Arthur the spool to hold. He ran lightly across the grass, sideways, to get up speed, and then he turned to meet the breeze. Up, 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 up went Stanley, being a kite. He knew just how to manage on the gusts of wind. He faced full into the wind if he wanted to rise, and then let it take him from behind when he wanted speed. He had only to turn his thin edge to the wind, carefully, a little at a time, so that it did not hold him, and then he would slip gracefully down toward the earth again. So he's kind of explaining how he's making the wind travel over his body so that the kite stays up in the air, not down on the ground if you've ever flown a kite. And now this is a little bit of our leftover from the last page. This is what those encyclopedia volumes look like, stacked on top of his brother Arthur. And if you look down here, I don't know if he's thinking that's the best plan anymore. Whether he's in pain or surprised, I don't know, but it doesn't look like a very good feeling. Arthur let out all the string, and Stanley soared high above the trees, a beautiful sight in his red shirt and blue trousers against the pale blue sky. Everyone in the park stood to watch. Stanley swooped right and then left in long matched swoops. He held his arms by his sides and zoomed at the ground like a rocket and curved up again toward the sun. He side-slipped and circled and made figure eights and crosses and a star. Nobody has ever flown the way Stanley Lambchop flew that day. Probably no one ever will again. After a while, of course, people grew tired of watching, and Arthur got tired of running about with the empty spool. Stanley went right on, though, showing off. 3 boys came up to Arthur and invited him to join them for a hot dog and some soda pop. Arthur left the spool wedged in the fork of a tree. He did not notice, while he was eating the hot dog, that the wind was blowing the string and tangling it about the tree. The string got shorter and shorter, but Stanley did not realize how low he was until leaves brushed his feet. And then it was too late. He got stuck in the branches. 15 minutes passed before Arthur and the other boys heard his cries and climbed up to set him free. Stanley would not speak to his brother that evening, and at bedtime, even though Arthur had apologized, he was still cross, which means angry. Alone with Mr. Lambchop in the living room, Mrs. Lambchop sighed and shook her head. You're at the office all day having fun, she said. You don't realize what I go through with the boys. They're very difficult. Kids are like that, Mr. Lambchop said. Phases. Be patient, dear. I'm sure many moms and dads can attest to that fact, that sometimes kids are a little bit challenging. But until tomorrow, friends, I will leave you with a little hint at Chapter 4, The Museum Thieves. Make some predictions. See you tomorrow.